welcome back. Today we're talking again about Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, and we'll be talking about chapters 15 through 18, which covers a lot of things. When we last left our heroes, Hester had decided to finally stand up for Dimmesdale and face off with Chillingworth. And in that conversation, she decided to finally tell Dimmesdale that Chillingworth was her husband. In so doing, she's setting off a course of events that will carry the action through the end of the book, after 7 years of basically nothing happening. Before we have that confession between Hester and Dimmesdale, we have a couple of chapters of Hester with Pearl. And although we may be tempted to just kind of rush ahead to find out how things are going to go down, we really shouldn't, because this first chapter, chapter 15, that deals with Hester and Pearl, has a conversation that at first may seem rather subtle, and much like many of the other conversations between Hester and Pearl, but yet has a really pivotal point that maybe everything hinges on. Let's look and see. So at the end of chapter 14, Hester had just finished her conversation with Chillingworth, and he turns back to go on gathering more herbs for his medicinal stuff. And the beginning of chapter 15 opens there, with Hester watching him go. And we see her sort of abject hatred for him as he walks away. He's the one who's just causing all of the grief left in her life. She already had enough problems without him around. As she watches him go, she sort of imagines him as this blasted, blighted, monstrous figure. Some sort of bat creature. Did the sun, which shone so brightly everywhere else, really fall upon him? Or was there, as it rather seemed, a circle of ominous shadow moving along with his deformity, whichever way he turned himself? Be it sin or no, said Hester Prynne bitterly as she still gazed after him. I hate the man. The emotions of that brief space, while she stood gazing after the crooked figure of old Roger Chillingworth, threw a dark light on Hester's state of mind, revealing much that she might not otherwise have acknowledged to herself. There's a darkness that she still feels as she looks at him, something that she can't really repent of or move past. Looking back at that memory of her relationship with him, which, yeah, it wasn't great, but it wasn't horrifying, becomes horrifying in retrospect, given the way everything has changed and transformed between those two times. And she can't help but compare Dimmesdale and Chillingworth in her mind. But she turns back to find Pearl. And Pearl has been wandering by the seaside, playing with little fish and things, and then she started gathering seaweed and arranging them into this gown for herself, particularly in a letter that she has created on her own chest. It's an A, but it's green because it's made out of seaweed. When Hester sees it, she responds to Pearl saying, "My little Pearl," said Hester, after a moment's silence, "the green letter on thy childish bosom has no purport. Dost thou know, my child, what the letter means which thy mother is doomed to wear?" And Pearl's like, yeah, it's a letter A, but that's all I know. And so Hester continues and says, "Dost thou know, child, wherefore thy mother wears this letter?" "Truly do I," answered Pearl, looking brightly into her mother's face. "It is for the same reason that the minister keeps his hand over his heart." And she's right. Again, that sort of freakishly clever intuition she's got going. Hester half smiles at the absurd incongruity of the child's observation, but on second thoughts, turning pale, says, "What has the letter to do with any heart save mine?" But Pearl doesn't know the answer to that, and so she suddenly wonders, what does the letter mean? And Pearl begins to ask what the letter means, and associates that also continually with Dimmesdale. She sees the connection there. And there's a really significant moment in which Pearl takes both of her mother's hands and looks into her eyes with a kind of earnestness that she doesn't always show. It showed Pearl in an unwanted aspect. Unwanted there is a word we don't use very often, W-O-N-T, which means uncharacteristic. It showed Pearl in an uncharacteristic aspect. Heretofore the mother, while loving her child with the intensity of a soul affection, had schooled herself to hope for little other return than the waywardness of an April breeze, which spends its time in airy sport, and has its gust of inexplicable passion, and is petulant at the best of moods, and chills oftener than it caresses you, when you take it into your bosom, in requital of which misdemeanors it will sometimes, of its own vague purpose, kiss your cheek with a kind of doubtful tenderness, and play gently with your hair, and then be gone about its other idle businesses, leaving a dreamy pleasure at your heart. And this, moreover, was a mother's estimate of the child's disposition. Any other observer might have seen few but unamiable traits, and have given them a far darker coloring. But now, the idea came strongly into Hester's mind that Pearl, with her remarkable precocity and acuteness, might already have approached the age when she could be made a friend, and entrusted with much of a mother's sorrow as could be imparted, without irreverence either to the parent or the child. In the little chaos of Pearl's character, there might be seen emerging, and could have been, from the very first, the steadfast principles of an unflinching courage, an uncontrollable will, a sturdy pride which might be disciplined into self-respect, and a bitter scorn of many things which, when examined, might be found to have the taint of falsehood in them. She possessed affections, too, though hitherto acrid and disagreeable as are the richest flavors of an unripened fruit. With all these sterling attributes, thought Hester, the evil which she inherited from her mother must be great indeed if a noble woman do not grow out of this elfish child. So although she's been really capricious and unpredictable and wild up to this point, and everyone sort of associates her with a fairy spirit or a sprite or an elf, Hester sees, maybe for the first time, the strength of Pearl's character that's growing out of her situation. And also she sees, for the first time, that Pearl might actually be a kind of friend to her. Not just a symbol of her shame, not just a burden that she loves but is also still a burden, but actually someone to share her experience with. Hester had often fancied that Providence had a design of justice and retribution in endowing the child with this marked propensity, but never until now had she bethought herself to ask whether linked with that design there might not likewise be a purpose of mercy and beneficence. If little Pearl were entertained with faith and trust, as a spirit messenger no less than an earthly child, might it not be her errand to soothe away the sorrow that lay cold in her mother's heart, and converted it into a tomb, and to help her to overcome the passion once so wild, and yet even neither dead nor asleep, but only imprisoned within that same tomb-like heart? Maybe Pearl is the kind of person who can help her mother to finally grow through the pain and the shame and the passion that she's got all stuck inside. And maybe with Pearl's help, she can finally overcome the last of her pain. And as she looks down at Pearl, she sees this opportunity. This is the first time she's really had the opportunity to share this, the depth of this, with Pearl. What does she do? And I think this next moment may be key, and rather pivotal to the plot at this point. Looking at Pearl, Hester finally decides and says, "What shall I say?" thought Hester to herself. "No, if this be the price of the child's sympathy, I cannot pay it." Then she spoke aloud. "Silly Pearl," said she, "what questions are these? There are many things in this world that a child must not ask about. What know I of the minister's heart? And as for the scarlet letter, I wear it for the sake of its gold thread." In all the 7 bygone years, Hester Prynne had never before been false to the symbol on her bosom. It may be that it was a talisman of a stern and severe, but yet a guardian spirit who now forsook her, as recognizing that, in spite of his strict watch over her heart, some new evil had crept into it, or some old one had never been expelled. As for little Pearl, the earnestness soon passed out of her face. Hester has a moment in which she has the opportunity to share something with Pearl, and grow a connection with Pearl, so that Pearl is no longer just a burden, just a symbol to her, and she doesn't take it. Furthermore, for the first time ever, she lies about the scarlet letter. Now, throughout the book, Hester's been the one that has to bear her shame right here where everyone can see it. But for the first time, she has covered it over. And covered it over to the one person who should matter most to her right now. The one person with whom she still really has a connection. Even more so than Dimmesdale. And by failing to do that, she opens herself up to a lot of other dangers down the road. She's borne the scarlet letter as a symbol of her shame. And in doing so, she has been in some ways better off than Dimmesdale. She certainly hasn't been well off. In fact, she's been pretty miserable. But she hasn't been tortured in the same way that Dimmesdale's been tortured. But in choosing to hide the meaning away from her child, we see the danger of walking the road that Dimmesdale did, keeping secrets down and causing her more pain. How is that going to influence her interaction with Dimmesdale in just a moment? Keep that in mind. In chapter 16, Hester and Pearl decide to go meet Dimmesdale, and they decide to meet him when he's out in the woods. Remember that the woods are kind of symbolic. Romantics love nature, they love being close to nature, they love being out in nature, but these dark romantics, and in particular these Puritans, have this kind of association between nature and darkness. We think back of all the associations between magic and the woods. You know, in fairy tales you wander off in the woods and you might be transformed, or you might have a complete reversal of fortune. The same is true for the Puritans, but they see the woods as something dark, ominous. That's where the black man is lurking, ready to get you. Remember my comments on the black man earlier, how he's that Puritan depiction of the devil, not a racial thing. And so it makes a lot of sense, symbolically and narratively, for Hester to go out into the woods to meet Dimmesdale. Dimmesdale's been out talking to Apostle Eliot, an Indian convert to Christianity. And as he's returning back to Boston, Hester and Pearl go out to meet him, so that they can have a conversation with him away from the public eye. And chapter 16 chronicles their walk into the woods to the place where Hester thinks Dimmesdale will be passing. Within it, again, we get another parade of symbols, much like their walk to the governor's house. There is first, and very notably, the sunshine, which is playing through the leaves and the trees, and sometimes appearing on the path in front of them, but then disappearing again. And you notice that whenever Hester reaches for the sunshine, it disappears. But whenever Pearl reaches for it, she's able to dance and play in the sunshine. There's also this little brook that, as it babbles and moves through the woods, it sounds like it's carrying a tale of human sorrow. As though a whole bunch of people have dumped their sorrows into this brook and it's just carrying them along. Which contrasts distinctly with Pearl, who doesn't seem to feel sorrow the way the rest of humanity does. And as Hester is looking at Pearl dancing in the sunlight, and in contrast with this stream, we have, again, her comments on that sense that Pearl doesn't seem to be connected with the rest of the world. Listen to the way she's described. There was no other attribute that so much impressed her with a sense of new and untransmitigated vigor in Pearl's nature as this never-failing vivacity of spirits. She had not the disease of sadness, which almost all children in these latter days inherit, with the scrofula, from other troubles of their ancestors. Perhaps this too was a disease, and but the reflex of the wild energy with which Hester had fought against her sorrows before Pearl's birth. It was certainly a doubtful charm, imparting a hard, metallic luster to the child's character. She wanted, what some people want throughout life, a grief that should deeply touch her, and thus humanize her, and make her capable of sympathy. But there was time enough yet for little Pearl. It's almost a foreshadowing there. Will Pearl ever be able to feel a kind of grief that connects her with the rest of humanity, that brings her back into the sphere of the human world? Or will she always be this other, this fairy child, this outsider? It's an important question, and one that we have to address before the end of the book. One more little moment in this chapter is that Pearl asks about the black man. Here they are out in the woods, so it's natural for her to talk about the black man. It's his domain, after all. And Pearl wants to know if Hester has ever had an encounter with the black man before. She's overheard some people talking about the black man, and she wants to know about him. She also wants to know if her mother leaves in the night regularly to go meet with the black man, as a lot of people say she does. Hester reassures her that she's never left her alone in the night. But Pearl also asks about the Scarlet Letter, if it is the mark of the black man. And Hester does answer, saying, "Once in my life I met the black man, and this Scarlet Letter is his mark." A few moments later, when Dimmesdale starts walking up the path, Pearl says, "Is it the black man coming?" But Hester says, "No, it's the minister. Look, see?" And Pearl says, "And so it is. And mother, he has his hand over his heart. Is it because when the minister wrote his name in the book, the black man set his mark in that place? But why does he not wear it on the outside of his bosom, as thou dost, mother?" Ah! Oh, Pearl is the most perceptive child ever. But Hester dismisses Pearl to go play nearby, stay close to the brook, and I'm going to have a conversation with the minister. And up comes Dimmesdale. And so it brings us finally to that interview with Dimmesdale. Chapter 17 opens as Hester and Dimmesdale sort of look at each other, and both of them are so sort of burdened with the world that it almost seems like they're seeing a ghost. "There you are. Is that really you? Is it really you?" This final reunion after all of these years, a real reunion, not just the passing each other in public and pretending like there's nothing between them. And so they have a moment of just like staring at each other and realizing that the other person is real. And then Dimmesdale asks Hester if she's found peace. Which, I mean, she's done her best, but no. And when she returns the question, he says, "None, nothing but despair. What else could I look for being what I am, and leading such a life as mine?" And then he goes on for about 2 pages describing how agonizingly miserable his situation is, for all the reasons that we've already seen. Here he is trying to look like a good man, but feeling guilty for it. Here he is trying to do good work, but feeling just even more hypocritical for it all the time. He wants to just finally be able to tear open everything and confess, but he can't. He wants to just fall down and die. He's miserable. One of the key aspects of Romanticism is a desire to escape your situation, that longing to just run away. Look how much of what Dimmesdale talks about expresses that idea here. Finally, he says, if there was just one person I could open everything up to and tell, one friend or one enemy, that would just give me so much relief, but I can't. I have to keep it all inside. And Hester pauses for a moment and says, "You have a friend in me. We both share it, so there's that. And there's also an enemy. I didn't tell you, but you live with my husband." She feels super horrible about it. In fact, she almost wishes she could die rather than tell him, but she has to, and so she tells him, and he's so horrified. I mean, obviously, what you'd expect. And he's just like wallowing in his horror and shame and awfulness, and he says, in the midst of this, "Woman, woman, thou art accountable for this. I cannot forgive thee." He doesn't mean it, but he's saying it. And he throws himself on the ground, and there's this great moment where Hester puts him in a headlock and holds him there. He's like, "You're gonna forgive me! I told you to forgive me!" With sudden and desperate tenderness, she threw her arms around him, and pressing his head against her bosom, little caring as though his cheek rested on the scarlet letter, he would have released himself, but strove in vain to do so. Hester would not set him free, lest he should look her sternly in the face. All the world had frowned on her. For 7 long years it had frowned upon this lonely woman, and still she bore it all, nor ever once turned away her firm, sad eyes. Heaven likewise had frowned upon her, and she had not died, but the frown of this pale, weak, sinful, and sorrow-stricken man was what Hester could not bear and live. "Wilt thou forgive me?" she repeated over and over again. "Wilt thou not frown? Wilt thou forgive?" Arrgh. Finally he responds. Now listen to the romanticism in this passage. "I do forgive you, Hester," replied the minister at length with a deep utterance out of the abyss of sadness, but no anger. "I freely forgive you now. May God forgive us both. We are not, Hester, the worst sinners in the world. There is one worse than even the polluted priest. That old man's revenge has been blacker than my sin. He has violated in cold blood the sanctity of a human heart. Thou and I, Hester, never did so." "Never, never," whispered she. "What we did had a consecration of its own. We felt it so. We said so to each other. Hast thou forgotten it?" "Hush, Hester," said Arthur Dimmesdale, rising from the ground. "No, I have not forgotten." First of all, look at the comparison of their guilt. What's the difference between their sin and Chillingworth's sin? Notice how they both forgive each other, but also feel like they deserve a kind of forgiveness. Yeah, they still feel guilty for their mistakes, and yeah, it's tearing their lives apart. But what they did was love, which is a positive emotion. And what Chillingworth is doing is out of absolute hatred, violating the sanctity of a human heart, as Dimmesdale says. And Hester takes it a step further. She says, what we did had a consecration of its own. We felt it so. When your feelings tell you that something is right, in Romanticism, that means it's right. Of course, reason and logic completely don't agree. But Romanticism, you trust your feelings. And trusting your feelings is a good thing, and an important thing. But it can also get you in horrible trouble. You have to balance feeling and logic. Feeling and reason. The Romantics tend to rush into feeling. I often compare this passage with my students with a similar passage in Goethe's Faust. Characters in that book are driven heavily by their feelings as well, to their own destruction. But if it felt right in the moment, it can't have been that bad, right? Even if it completely destroys me. Ah, well. They sit down side by side and everything's been said and confessed now. But Dimmesdale feels completely hopeless, and he says, "Oh, what can I do now? I can't go back to living with Chillingworth." And so Hester starts laying out some options for him. "Well, why don't you run away? Why don't you go anywhere except for here? You don't have to stay here. You could leave." And he keeps being like, "No, I'm too weak. I can't do it. I can't. Must I sink down here and die at once?" But Hester's like, "No, get up and go. You can do it. Come on. Pull yourself together, man." Dimmesdale replies, "There is not strength or courage left me to venture into this wide, strange, difficult world alone. I can't do it alone." And so then Hester says, "Thou shalt not go alone." She's gonna run away with him! What? And so we come to chapter 18, which is entitled A Flood of Sunshine. And we've talked over and over again about how sunshine is heavily symbolic within this book, and never more so than in this chapter. So keep your eyes on it. After Hester says she's going to run away with him, Hester and Dimmesdale have this moment where they look at each other. And then, of course, Nathaniel Hawthorne has to step back and process it all. And for a couple of pages he does just that, looking at what has brought Hester to the point where she feels like this is a good course of action. And then looking at Dimmesdale and seeing how he's going to react to this. I mean, all the shame and guilt that he's felt about his relationship with Hester in the past have nearly destroyed him. Is he going to now be able to run away with her? And what will that mean for him? And even though Hester has definitely burned all of her bridges and she's done with the rest of society, is this going to be good for her? Dimmesdale, who's sort of frozen in this moment, processing all of this, ultimately comes to a conclusion. He says, "If in all these past 7 years I could recall one thought of peace or hope, I would yet endure, for the sake of that earnest of heaven's mercy. But now, since I am irrevocably doomed, wherefore should I not snatch the solace allowed to the condemned culprit before his execution? Or if this be the path to a better life, as Hester would persuade me, I surely give up no fairer prospect by pursuing it. Neither can I any longer live without her companionship, so powerful is she to sustain, so tender to soothe. O thou to whom I dare not lift mine eyes, wilt thou yet pardon me?" So he feels that he's dooming himself here. He's condemning himself forever. And yet, he doesn't feel any hope anyway. Why not take this course? So that's a conclusion. It's just not really necessarily a happy one. But once he does make the decision, all of a sudden he does feel reawakened and joyful, a sense of hope. "Do I feel joy again?" cried he, wondering at himself. "Methought the germ of it was dead in me. O Hester, thou art my better angel. I seem to have flung myself, sick, sin-stained, and sorrow-blackened, down upon these forest leaves, and to have risen up all made anew, and with new powers to glorify him that hath been merciful. This is already the better life. Why did we not find it sooner?" And then Hester undergoes a similar transformation. She takes off her head covering and loosens her hair. And then she takes off the scarlet letter and flings it away. There played around her mouth and beamed out of her eyes a radiant and tender smile that seemed gushing from the very heart of womanhood. A crimson flush was glowing on her cheek that had been long so pale. Her sex, her youth, her whole richness of her beauty came back from what men call the irrevocable past and clustered themselves with her maiden hope and a happiness before unknown within the magic circle of this hour. And as if the gloom of the earth and sky had been but the effluence of these two mortal hearts, it vanished with their sorrow, all at once, as with a sudden smile of heaven, forth burst the sunshine, pouring a very flood into the obscure forest, gladdening each green leaf, transmuting the yellow fallen ones into gold, and gleaming adown the grey trunks of the solemn trees. The objects that had made a shadow hitherto embodied the brightness now. The course of the little brook might be traced by its merry gleam afar into the wood's heart of mystery, which had become a mystery of joy. Hester is again transformed. Remember that chapter earlier where we saw all of her features sort of crushed down by her shame, and particularly noted in the way her hair disappeared. Now, with her hair free again and the sunshine beaming down on her, she's been transformed. What does the sunshine mean here? Well, it's certainly complicated throughout the book, isn't it? There's a vivacity and joy and life to the sunshine pouring down on them. Whereas in other places, the sunshine seemed to pour down to reveal their shame. Hawthorne says, "Love, whether newly born or aroused from a death-like slumber, must always create a sunshine, filling the heart so full of radiance that it overflows upon the outward world. Had the forest still kept its gloom, it would have been bright in Hester's eyes and bright in Arthur Dimmesdale's. Their love is reawakening the sunshine. And Hester says, oh, you've got to see Pearl now. Now she's going to be your child. Now you can claim her. And so she calls to Pearl, and Pearl runs up on the other side of the brook. And Pearl is also transformed by the forest. She has, like at the seashore, been putting on all these flowers and decorating herself with all these bits and pieces of the forest. And in fact, the book goes on to describe how as she was walking through the woods, all of nature seemed to be sort of in tune with her. The animals seemed to recognize her as a kindred wild spirit. And here she stands on the opposite side of the brook, looking at them. And that's where the chapter ends. We're going to see Pearl's reaction to Dimmesdale and to this new situation in the next chapter. And since we've seen how Pearl reacts to Dimmesdale in the past, sometimes positively and sometimes negatively, as a sort of barometer for how sincere she feels Dimmesdale's heart is, how is she going to take this, and what will it mean? That's something that we'll have to look at in Chapter 19. Thanks for watching. You can click to subscribe or to watch the next video, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.